This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. My guest is Lisa Schwartz, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory Manager, Senior Policy Researcher, and Senior Strategic Advisor. Lisa joined Berkeley Lab as an energy efficiency team leader over a decade ago after almost 40 years in energy leadership and research positions with the Oregon Department of Energy, the Regulatory Assistance Project, the Oregon Public Utility Commission, and Oregon State University. In this opening episode of the USEA Power Sector Podcast series on new utility planning paradigms, we're going to talk about gathering impacts on the power sector today of variable and customer-owned energy resources, of new demand, and of new policy. And Lisa is going to give us an overview of the newest utility innovations, optimized, least cost, reliable electricity delivery, like integrated resource planning, integrated distribution system planning, and integrated system planning. So Lisa, things are changing fast. Traditional planning processes are just no longer adequate to protect least cost, reliable electricity delivery. Before we get into the specifics of the new planning approaches now being used and tested, why is this shift in planning happening? And what is the overall long-term goal?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. Don't know how much time you have, but let me give you just a few uh, that you've read and heard about and studied. So certainly we have far higher levels of variable renewable resources like wind and solar, and that's because of technology innovation, economies of scale. So prices are down, and they're acquiring more of these resources. But now they need to plan on a far more granular level, ideally hourly or even sub-hourly, instead of planning for the single peak load of the year. That's a big
Right.
change.
Yeah.
With rising operational costs and regulations, primarily environmental, many aging fossil fuel plants, they're just retiring. And utilities need to replace these very large resources in the face of so many uncertainties, from loads, market prices, regulations, you name it. We've also got other technology advancements like solar plus storage and grid interactive loads. And now you can aggregate these distributed resources and they can serve energy and capacity needs for the bulk power system, and they can provide a host of grid services and help meet distribution system needs. That's a big change. We've been hearing a lot about the rapid rise in data centers and other AI driven load growth. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of investments in industrial facilities. We've got electrification for transportation and for buildings, primarily space and water heating right now in many parts of this country. And we've got a plan to serve this load. We've
So,
also got increasing frequency and severity of weather events. So
mm,
utilities and other entities like regional planning entities, they've got a plan to maintain resilience under really challenging conditions throughout all the levels of the power system, from generation to transmission and distribution. And finally, you've got regulated utilities in some states with decarbonization targets, and they're planning for zero carbon resources during the typical study period, 20 years for integrated resource plans. So I could go on, but that's a lot right there. So the whole goal here is, how do we maintain reliability and resilience of the bulk power system at least cost and risk? Because we need to plan for adequate power generation and transmission. And remember, demand side resources like energy efficiency and demand flexibility. And that's just on the bulk power system. Then we've got to maintain reliability and resilience and affordability for all the local grids that serve us at our homes and businesses, also at least cost and risk. And we need, again, to plan there for adequate, and I would say nimble, distribution
mm,
systems that can not only accommodate solar and storage and all of these other grid interactive technologies, but also harness them to provide a host of grid services to try to maintain affordability.
Right. So all we have to do is rebuild the airplane's engine while we're flying it. No big deal. Um, Now, a few years ago, this became obvious, these needs became obvious, and the most familiar new process that was then introduced was something called Integrated Resource Planning, or IRP. What is that? How long have utilities been testing it? And has it proved to be effective, in achieving the policy goals that we now have and dealing with the resources that we now have?
Well, an integrated resource plan is what I would call a roadmap for meeting forecasted electricity demand over whatever specified future period, often is 20 years. And it considers both supply side and demand side resources. So it provides a host of information on electricity demand, reliability metrics, costs, risks and uncertainties, and other important issues that affect utility customers. Historically, the focus has been just on the bulk power system.
Mhm.
The process provides utilities with a framework for evaluating, a whole range of plausible futures for the electric system in the face of these uncertainties and risks, and get input from stakeholders and ultimately for regulated utilities from their regulators. The whole goal is demonstrating which resource portfolio is most likely to be least cost in the face of all of these risks and uncertainties. So IRP has been around for a long, long time, since the late 1980s.
Mm.
That's when concerns over fuel price volatility and the reliability of the bulk power system prompted states to begin requiring the electric utilities to examine the prudency and affordability of their investments sort of at this planning stage. Today, a majority of states require vertically integrated electric utilities, that is, those utilities uh, that are still planning for generation and not just distribution. The majority of states today require these vertically integrated utilities that are under their jurisdiction to file long-term resource plans, typically IRPs. So,
Mm.
in my view, and I think is demonstrated by these continuing state requirements, integrated resource planning has been highly successful in helping states meet their policy goals, like renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency goals, a host of things. And because states update their guidance for these resource plans over time to address new policies and planning challenges, they can stay effective if they're
Mm.
executed well. And we have a new report by Berkeley Lab and our partner Synapse Energy Economics coming out soon that gets into what we think are the best practices that have been demonstrated by utilities over time.
So if integrated resource planning, IRP, has been successful, why are we now beginning to talk about something called integrated distribution system planning, or IDSP? And has it been effective at bringing in customer-owned distributed energy resources, we call it DER, that are on the distribution system? Is that being brought into the planning process to help optimize reliable, affordable electricity delivery? You mentioned those resources in your earlier comments. Is that what IDSP is for?
Those are all great questions. And let me start by sort of defining it the way I think about it and the way US Department of Energy, our funder, is viewing this. So integrated distribution system planning is a systematic approach to satisfy a whole host of things. Customers, their service expectations, state goals, which we just talked about, and also utility objectives for grid planning and design. These are the utility systems, right? So utilities are doing the planning. So the process addresses reliability, resilience, importantly, safety, operational efficiency, and, like you asked, the integration and use of distributed resources. And it also includes a grid modernization roadmap. So it is a lot. And about 20 states today have guidance or some sort of requirement for utilities to file some type of distribution plan. Now they're on the spectrum. Some are just focused on certain aspects, and some are full blown, what I would call truly integrated distribution system plans. But I want to provide some important context to think about why this is so important.
Mm.
So I'm always tracking the Edison Electric Institute's CapEx, or in other words, capital investments. Um, they survey their members, and they've got an aggregate of all of the investor-owned utilities and their expenditures across the electricity system. They publish this annually. So their recent estimate, which was for 2024, they're projecting by the end of 2024, they estimate that more than $186 billion in distribution capital investments alone for the investor-owned utilities. So that's about a third of all of the utilities' capital expenditures. That's more they spend on anything else.
Wow.
That big number, the 186 billion, that doesn't include the investment that the rural electric co-ops are making and the municipal utilities are making. So I wanted to give you those numbers to provide some context for how important this is. The other
Is that,
context I wanted to provide is we talked about IRP. Sure.
Lisa, let me just interrupt you. Is that money, is that investment in technologies to manage what's happening at the distribution system level, or is that actual investment in DER at the distribution system level?
No, it's capital investment. So, there are rules around what is a capital investment versus an expense. So first of all, it has to be something the utility owns, right? And it's
Like
investing.
upgrades in poles and wires that
Sure.
bring
Poles and
the stuff.
wires, all the grid mod technologies. It depends on the regulatory environment. Some of the other technologies and systems might be considered capital investment, or they might not be, right? So, that's very state specific, but generally we're talking about hard stuff, these
So,
capital investments.
so the point is that there's an enormous amount of investment going into modernizing the distribution system to accommodate customer demand, new loads, new customer resources, that sort of thing, right?
That's right. These figures are for all of it. It's the poles and wires plus grid mod plus anything else that's needed, just capital investments. So we're not even talking about O&M expenses, operation and maintenance, right?
Mm.
So so we've been doing it for IRP since the late 1980s, right? We've been doing it for the bulk power system. So certainly, it's well past time to do it for the distribution system. And so these distribution planning processes that we're talking about, they're really analogous to those used for integrated resource planning for decades. And the distribution planning processes are really important to pay more attention to all these costs we just talked about. But there are other benefits too. So remember, a real hallmark of good planning practice or typical planning practice is to make utility investment plans transparent in a holistic way before things show up individually in a rate case, in separate rate cases for separate investments. So this is a place to bring it all together holistically and make it transparent for stakeholders and for regulators in the case of regulated utilities. I also am a firm believer, based on my experience in the regulatory world, we improve outcomes if we have meaningful engagement by stakeholders and regulators upfront during the planning process. And with all the things that I talked about at the beginning of this podcast, all those uncertainties in forecasts for loads, distributed resources, we really need to use multiple scenarios. And this is something we've done in IRP for bulk power system for a long, long time, and it is very nascent for distribution planning. We really need these scenarios for electrification, for high levels of solar and storage, for climate impacts, and so on. Nobody knows the future. We're going to be wrong. So we have to have robust planning where we make our decisions in light of multiple possible plausible futures. And finally, I think when we have this information, we can enable customers and third parties to propose grid solutions and participate in providing grid services. And that might be cheaper for customers. Again, you got to be looking at these costs. So as far as your question about, are we effective in this process in bringing customer-owned resources into it, I'd say utilities and states haven't made as much progress as I expected by now. And it's not for lack of trying.
Right.
But we look at this through three lenses, the three Ps: pricing, programs, and procurements. So Pricing is maybe the most nascent. So my colleague JP Carballo and I published a paper last year on price-based demand flexibility, both in resource planning and distribution planning. And we found that the evaluation of price-based demand response as a solution is uncommon in both
Right.
resource planning, which again has been going on for decades, and distribution planning processes, which, I'm talking about the transparent ones, publicly filed plans, in the last 10 years. It's just still really nascent.
Right. That's I wrote about that and I'm very aware of it. Lisa, we have one more question I really want to get to. We don't have a whole lot of time. I'm sorry, but I do want to remind our listeners that Berkeley Lab has a set of papers on this subject, and they're coming with a new one very soon on all these topics. These are deep questions. But the final one I want to ask you is Berkeley Lab has proposed something called integrated system planning, which sort of brings together IRP and IDSP. Maybe that's not the right way to say it. But why is it needed? I presume that hasn't been, if IDSP hasn't had much use, I can't imagine ISP has. But is it the ultimate solution? And did I say it right? Is it bringing together the whole system?
Well, first of all, this is not our creation. This is
Ah,
something that's been developed, and is under development by the industry, by utilities, consultants, academics. So how you define it depends on whom you ask. So in some cases, the term refers to like bringing together just sort of generation, transmission, and distribution expansion. And that means, at its basic, using consistent load forecasts, considering distributed resources as resources, not inputs, and co-optimizing like generation and transmission and distribution. But in the future, it really means that resources interconnected to the distribution system are providing services all across the board for both transmission and distribution. And to some degree, these solutions can be fungible across all levels of the system. But that's the way most people talk about it today. But importantly, in other contexts, integrated system planning may mean integrating electricity and natural gas planning.
ah, interesting.
So I think we need integrated system planning, and I think it's going to continue to grow for all the things I mentioned: reliability, resilience, affordability, in the face of all of these disruptions. And if you're only considering part of the system at a time, and you're only considering electricity and not natural gas, you're really not optimizing. So in terms of how effective it is so far, it's really new. There aren't many examples of where and how it's used. We can look at Excel Energy in Colorado. They've outlined a vision for where they want to go with this. Salt River Project in Arizona is one of the first utilities in the US to use an integrated system plan. Puget Sound Energy in Washington State is working right now on its first integrated system plan, and that's in compliance with new Washington State law to do so. And that one is considering gas as well. They are a dual fuel utility, electricity and gas. So I think the jury's out. We're
Yeah.
just starting in this place, but I do think that that holistic picture is really needed.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great place to leave it. What I like about this idea is that for several decades, or uh, at least several presidential administrations, Democrat and Republican, we've been talking about, and I think we still will continue talking about all of the above. And the great thing about this system planning idea is that we can do all of the above planning and understand with concrete data what is the best way to proceed. And we'll be talking about that on this series about utility planning as we go forward. But right now, I want to thank Berkeley Lab Manager, Senior Policy Researcher, and Senior Strategic Advisor Lisa Schwartz for describing the evolving utility planning paradigm that it seeks to integrate all of the resources available to the power sector and meet power sector needs of today and tomorrow. As always, I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know. By the way, now on Spotify and Apple, as well as YouTube. Don't forget our quest for energy transition solutions.